Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. We've got another episode of the show for you today. This is the second episode released today, and it's with returning guest James M. Dorsey of the Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey Substack. He's been covering issues related to the Middle East for many years now, and I consider him a valuable resource of information. We've had many conversations with him on this show. I hold him in very high regard, and we're doing another Middle East update with James, and we'll be discussing Netanyahu's visit to Washington, D.C. This was recorded the same day Netanyahu came to D.C. We'll also be talking about what has transpired in Rafah, the killing of medics in Rafah, and just the overall destruction of the southern city of Rafah in Gaza. We'll talk about where things go from here, what leverage the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, may have in regard to determining the future of Gaza, and we'll talk about James' hypothesis about the rise of civilizational states versus nation states. All that and much more, including a discussion of the battle of narratives between Israelis and Palestinians. So much ground covered in this conversation. With that being said, let's get right to it with James M. Dorsey. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. We've got another episode of the show for you today. This is the second episode released today, and it's with returning guest James M. Dorsey of the Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey Substack. He's been covering issues related to the Middle East for many years now, and I consider him a valuable resource of information. We've had many conversations with him on this show. I hold him in very high regard, and we're doing another Middle East update with James, and we'll be discussing Netanyahu's visit to Washington, D.C. This was recorded the same day Netanyahu came to D.C. We'll also be talking about what has transpired in Rafah, the killing of medics in Rafah, and just the overall destruction of the southern city of Rafah in Gaza. We'll talk about where things go from here, what leverage the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, may have in regard to determining the future of Gaza, and we'll talk about James' hypothesis about the rise of civilizational states versus nation states. All that and much more, including a discussion of the battle of narratives between Israelis and Palestinians. So much ground covered in this conversation. With that being said, let's get right to it with James M. Dorsey. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to welcome back to the show. He's one of our regulars when it comes to covering the Middle East and especially Israel-Palestine. James M. Dorsey of the Turbulent World blog and Substack. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well, but things have gotten very just unpleasant when it comes to looking at what is happening with regards to Gaza right now. I don't know, what are your initial thoughts on where things are at right now? I mean, we just saw the Gaza medic attacks, and also Rafah just seems to be reduced to rubble based on the images I'm seeing.
Well, I mean, in a headline fashion, if you wish, I think the Israelis have no good options. I think I'm a minority, maybe the only one who's saying this, but I think that their window of opportunity is closing. And you know, basically the strategy, the Israeli strategy has failed. You saw that now with yesterday's rocket attacks on Ashkelon and Ashdod, the failure to free the hostages, and their options are basically, obviously the obvious option would be the best option would be solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, agree to an Israel-Palestinian state. That's not going to happen clearly anytime soon. In the absence of that, they either have to take full military control of the Strip, which would mean administering the Strip, or they could go for a long-term siege or continuation of what is already a long-term siege, or alternatively, they could go for a Palestinian administration under Israeli supervision, made up of Gazan notables and businessmen. Uh, I think the important note here is, in my mind, well, there's several things. One is, of course, the Trump Netanyahu meeting later today, but also what has gone relatively underreported, or I think the significance of which may not be recognized, is the visit to Abu Dhabi by the Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar.
Can you speak to that a little bit more? I didn't know about this meeting.
Meeting was this weekend. Now, to keep in mind a number of factors. The UAE, privately, not publicly, is Israel's best friend in the Arab world. And there's a lot of coordination. The UAE was principally opposed to the Arab plan that was put forward at the Arab summit in Cairo last month, and in fact privately advised the Trump administration that it was opposed to it. Its opposition was primarily the fact that Hamas would remain in place in Gaza. You also had the Emirati ambassador to Washington, Yusuf Al-Otaiba, come out saying that there was no alternative to the Trump plan. You had the reports of the United States asking several countries, among which Somaliland, whether they would accept Palestinian Gazan Palestinians who want to resettle. Somaliland is a UAE-backed breakaway state from Somalia. So in that sense, I think, and finally, the UAE wants in a post-war Palestinian administration, it wants its candidate, Mohammed Dahlan, a former security chief, someone who's close to the Emirati president, Mohammed bin Zayed, a politician, a businessman. He's from Khan Yunis. They would like to see him play a major role in the post-war arrangements.
Now, you mentioned earlier you see Israel's window of opportunity closing. I guess for my listeners, what do you mean? Window of opportunity for what exactly?
So what I mean with that is the following. Trump has essentially given Netanyahu a green light in Gaza. The Saudis, the Emiratis, other Gulf states are not happy about that. There are $2.4 trillion on the table for Saudi and UAE investments in the coming years in the United States. That gives the Saudis and the Emiratis a lot of leverage. You have Trump planning his first overseas trip to the Gulf, and he's made money, if you wish, central to that trip. So I don't see how. Let me put it differently. Trump has got to now start balancing his support for Israel with what's on offer from the Gulf. He's not going to let $2.4 trillion go down the drain for Netanyahu. And so that's what I mean by a window of opportunity. We may not see that reflected in what public statements are made today during the talks at the White House, but I'm sure that privately Netanyahu is being told that things will have to change, or that he has a limited time to get done what he wants to get done.
I hope this is a worthwhile question. You can tell me if you think it's off base, but sometimes I think people underestimate the sort of Gulf's role in all of this and their leverage in regards to Israel Palestine. Um, can you speak to why you think that may be, or am I off base? I mean, I think people do underestimate how the Gulf states view this whole thing.
I think the answer is yo. With other words, there's no doubt in my mind that the Gulf is horrified by what's happening. And the pictures just get worse. Look at the pictures today of a Palestinian journalist burning alive. It's just unimaginable. Now, having said that, the Saudis, the Emiratis have never had a great love for the Palestinians. They certainly do not want to see Hamas in place in Gaza. But they have, and they see the Gaza war and the possible fallouts of all of that, Iran, Yemen, and so on. They see that as a threat. It destabilizes the region. It runs the risk of an all-out war in the region, whereas they want to really be focused on economic development, economic growth, and diversification, on top of which their finances have just been thrown into disarray by Trump's tariffs. Look at the fall of the oil prices. Now, having said that, all of that, in 18 months, 17 months, whatever it is, of the Gaza war, there hasn't been much coming out of the Gulf except for statements and humanitarian aid that can't get in. So, in that sense, but their leverage is one, a long-standing relationship with Trump, and a lot of money on the table. And sure, they've also, certainly in the case of Saudi Arabia, they've been instrumental in relations between Russia and the United States, which, even though my guess is that it's more logistics than substance. The UAE has offered to mediate in the case of Iran, and that mediation offer is not off the table either by the Iranians or the United States. So in that sense, there is there are a limited degree of leverage that they have. In my mind, the foremost leverage is $2.4 trillion. Just think of it this way: when have you last seen $2.4 trillion in investments on the table?
Right, right. Well, I wanted to like hone in on that a little bit more because I think there is this narrative that some people have that the Saudis just fall in line with everything the U.S. or Israel wants, and I think that the Saudis may have different national interests and security interests than Israel at times, or they may have issues where they don't see eye to eye.
Well, that's certainly true. There are any number of issues that they don't see eye and eye. But if you look at the trend, they, like the Emirates, have prioritized in some ways their relations with the United States. So if you look at artificial intelligence technology, over the last year, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have said, our AI partner is the United States, at the cost of reducing technology cooperation with China. The U.S. may not be a reliable partner in many ways. Go back to the 2019 Houthi attacks on the Saudi oil facilities and the attack on the Abu Dhabi International Airport. But nonetheless, they don't have another address to turn to at this point. So, it's in that sense, it's a much more checkered lay of the land.
In terms of Netanyahu's visit to DC today, how important do you think it is that people keep an eye on what goes on with that? Because I know you did a whole video on this on your channel.
Look, I think it's very important. First of all, Netanyahu was the first foreign leader to visit Washington and meet with Trump. He's now the first foreign leader to have a face-to-face discussion on the tariffs. And he's the first foreign leader to have two meetings in the White House with Trump in a matter of two plus months. In that sense, Trump's putting him on a pedestal. What I find interesting is that this second meeting was arranged at very short notice. It was a phone call from Trump to Netanyahu while Netanyahu was in Budapest saying, "Why don't you come?" Trump doesn't just do that. He doesn't. He's very transactional. So there are a number of key issues here, which I think are important. One is tariffs, and the Israelis tried to be smart but failed. So, with other words, on the eve of the tariffs, they lifted all levies on U.S. imports into Israel in the hope that would spare them. It didn't. Mind you, they're on the lower end of the tariffs list with only 17%. But that's significant at a moment at which the Israeli economy is battered as a result of 18 months of war. Then you have Gaza, of course. And as I said, I think that there's going to be a point at which Trump will have to balance his Gulf interests with his support for Israel, and that will have to be at the expense of Netanyahu. Then you have Iran. Now, the Israelis are not particularly enamored by negotiations with Iran, and they're not totally convinced that Trump is going to try and strike a very hard deal. But they're not going to be an obstacle to those negotiations. But ultimately, they want to see military action, whether that's a green light for Israeli military action, or whether that's a joint U.S. Strike or strikes or joint operations. But in any case, military action. You also have Syria, where you've got potentially a Turkish-Israeli conflagration, with the Israelis feeling very uncomfortable with Turkish moves in Syria, including a military base. I mean, just a few days ago, they bombed the sites the Turks were looking at for a military base. So those are all very important issues with significant consequences for the region. And again, the Gulf, it's a different world. So during Trump's first term, the Saudis, but also the Emiratis, but in principle the Saudis, were much more assertive in the way they wanted policy towards Iran to develop. You've since had in 2021 the reestablishment of diplomatic relations. The Saudis do not want to see a situation in which the conflict with Iran drags the region into a full all-out conflagration in which potentially they could be targets.
With regards to Syria and Turkey, I sometimes come up against a wall with some folks who will say to me, well, Turkey has always, at least in a public-facing way, sort of claimed to be critical of Israel, but, privately it hasn't always really pushed back against Israel as much. But I think that has changed in the past year and a half since the Gaza war. I was wondering if you could comment on, do you think there's been a shift in the relationship between Israel and Turkey?
It's deteriorated. There's no question about it. Now, having said that, Erdogan, the Turkish president, has been very vocal, including calling Hamas a liberation movement, and very critical of Israel. The Israelis are much more assertive across the board against anyone who's critical of them. Look at what happened with the two British parliamentarians over the weekend. and the maybe not declared, but de facto, Israel's defense doctrine has changed in the sense that it wants to see the areas it borders on demilitarized, or if not demilitarized, uh, uh, militarily populated by forces they feel more comfortable with. You see that in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon. You see that with the the destruction that they caused of the Syrian military after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the banning of Syrian forces south of Damascus, uh, uh, asserting themselves as the protectors of the Druze in southern Syria. Um, so all of that obviously contributes to a uh, to strained relations with Israel. And then you add to that the perceived ambitions of Erdogan, um, rivalry with Iran, Turkish advances in the Horn of Africa. So, but having said all of that, what is also true is that Erdogan hasn't fully acted on what he has said. So he declared a boycott of Israel. Trade is continuing. Some assessments are that it's even increased. And so I think that's where you're meeting resistance.
In terms of, and I hope this isn't too out of bounds. What about what is happening politically in Israel itself? I was talking recently to the Israeli pollster Dalia Schindlin, and one thing she noted is that Netanyahu recently has been sort of amping up Trumpian rhetoric about the deep state. He's been attacking what he calls the sort of leftist deep state in the U.S. and Israel amidst, I believe last month, a number of his aides were caught up in a probe. And just a few days ago, we had the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, saying there is no deep state, no dictatorship. Meanwhile, you have Netanyahu himself like pushing these lines about, there's a deep state in Israel and it needs to be fought. Do you think this is relevant at all, or am I off base?
No, I think it is relevant, but I think it's part of a much broader trend in which you see what I call civilizationalist leaders, many of them on the right, if not the far right, including people like Trump, like Viktor Orban, like Vladimir Putin, who all speak about the deep state. And Trump and Netanyahu, it falls into that ilk. Now, to put it into context, this is an Israeli government that prioritizes. Okay, let me put it. This is the government of a state that asserts that it is the state of the Jews, that prioritizes its relationships with the far right, including forces with Nazi or neo-Nazi anti-Semitic roots, above relationships with Jewish communities abroad. To take the Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs and combating anti-Semitism. He has spent the last year and a half traveling the world, meeting with far-right forces in countries where there are Jewish communities where he did not bother to meet with them. You had last week an international conference on combating anti-Semitism in Jerusalem, where the likes of the French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, the chief rabbi of Britain, Jason Greenblatt, the head of the the Anti-Defamation League, senior French and U.S. officials, and German officials involved in fighting anti-Semitism, back out of that conference because of the presence of the likes of the National Rally in France, Vox in Spain, and Dodik, the president of the break of Bosnia, the Bosnian Serbs, who has an arrest warrant out for him. Uh, so that's where Netanyahu is, and so his references to the deep state in a situation in which his popularity is tanking again, in which he has court cases and has to appear in court. So his visit today to Washington had to be authorized by judges because he was supposed to be in court today. And he has to be back in Israel by Wednesday because he has to be in court. Uh, he has the Qatar scandal, where members of his staff were working for the Qataris in terms of their public relations and their image building. So he has multiple issues, of course.
I think he even
Leave
had
aside.
issues recently with Ronan Barr from the Shin Bet.
Well, I was just going to say, leave aside other domestic issues, which include his trying to curtail democratic freedoms, the firing of, or his attempt to fire the head of the Shin Bet, his attempt to fire the attorney general.
So, in your mind, where is all of this headed? Because, I mean, it seems like there's both issues related specifically to Israel, but also trends that are uh, happening in Israel, but also across other parts of the world.
Well, I think they're all interlinked. So on the one hand, I think that we are in a world in which the far right leaders, civilizational leaders, are on the up and coming. You can argue, of course, that that's supercharged with Trump. Uh, but on the other hand, you can also argue, and you may be a better judge of that than I am, that Trump has a 2-year window. After that, Republicans have to start thinking about the world after Trump. Um, so there's, and then you have on the other side Netanyahu's specific problems. Um, I think what you've seen in the recent days, including the killings of Palestinian Red Crescent medical and aid workers, and what happened today with the journalists and other Palestinians, those pictures are going round, and they're getting worse by the day. I don't see how that is sustainable. And on top of which, my thesis that the blank check support, or Trump's blank check support for Netanyahu, is a window of opportunity that's going to close.
Why do you think Trump is going to, maybe turn away from that blank check support? Like, is
Because
there
of the Gulf.
like what's the evidence for your thesis, or what's your thinking?
Well, look, what I said before, uh, the Saudis, the Emiratis have made no public linkage to their investment offers, or between their investment offers and US policy. But there's no way that they're not going to use that leverage. And there's no way that when Trump, by the latest Trump, when Trump gets to the Middle East, that's going to dominate the conversation. So that's what I base it on. The proof will be in the pudding. And as I said, I'm not aware of anyone else who was arguing it that way. But we'll see. But for me, it's 1 and 1 is 2.
Okay, I see.
Let me just add one other thing. Let me just add one
Yeah, I
other
wanted you
thing.
to maybe elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, the Saudis, particularly the Saudis, but the Emiratis too, but particularly the Saudis. Um, it's what Mohammed bin Salman said some time ago. I don't care about the Palestinians, but my people do. So he has to be seen to be trying to come to the help of the aid of the Palestinians. if you're putting that kind of money on the table without bringing these issues up and trying to get a quid pro quo for it, um, I think that could have domestic repercussions. I'm not saying that Mohammed bin Salman would be overthrown or anything like that, but he is sensitive to public opinion in the kingdom.
In regards to the killing of those 15 medics in Gaza, do you have any more commentary on that? I haven't been able to keep up with it as much, but I know video has come out that seems to contradict what Israel was saying, and I know Israel has sort of walked back its account now of what happened. Is this a big deal, and do you think it's going to become a bigger part of, I guess, the narrative wars that are happening now?
Look, I think it's a big deal in and of itself, but more importantly, we've seen a war, and this is not to excuse anything that Hamas did on October 7th, which was a war crime, period. Uh, even if there are explanations, whatever you want to, it's a war crime. But this kind of total disregard for human life, the blocking for more than a month of humanitarian aid into a war-ravaged uh, territory, pushing the population into 35% of the territory, a territory that already before the war was the densest populated area of the world, is just not sustainable.
I wanted to ask you in regard, I mean, maybe this will segue into the recent, what's been called the anti-Hamas protests, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I think something that gets overlooked by someone talking about these issues is I think there's a sort of complex interplay between the actions of the Israeli right and the way Hamas acts, and there's sort of a cycle of radicalization that happens. Um, can you speak to that? Am I on the right track there?
The answer is again, yes and no. I've traditionally argued that militant Palestinian groups like Hamas or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or Islamic Jihad and Israel were certainly Israel under Netanyahu were mirror images of one another. Um, I think that's it's a matter of principle still true, but Hamas wants a ceasefire. And okay, to take a step back, we've seen over the last year in November of 2023 and in the first phase of the ceasefire that broke down last month that Palestinians were released in bits and sorry, hostages were exchanged for Palestinians in Israeli prisons in bits and pieces. 3 here, 4 there, this, that, the other. That was not what Hamas necessarily wanted. Hamas was and is ready for a deal today in which it releases all hostages in exchange for an end to the war and an Israeli withdrawal. The staging uh, of those hostage releases was what Netanyahu wanted, because it first of all prolonged the war, and second of all, it um, it didn't force him to negotiate an end to the war and an Israeli withdrawal.
I mentioned those protests that happened in Gaza. Some have been characterizing them as anti-Hamas protests, and I think there's been people sort of using these protests in a way to bolster their own narratives that they may have. Um, and I also think that a lot of these protesters sound like they're sort of against everyone, whether it's Hamas or Israel or even Fatah. So I don't know what your handle is on it, but maybe you could give your
Look,
thoughts.
there's no doubt in my mind that Hamas's popularity at this moment is rock bottom. That doesn't mean that Hamas is going to disappear as a political force. It doesn't mean that still has an infrastructure in Gaza, and that it will be a player. But Gazans want an end to this war, and they blame everybody and his mother, including Hamas, for this war continuing. Now, does that necessarily mean that they've given up on the armed struggle? Probably not. But they want an end to this war now. Uh, and once the guns fall silent, just think of what the next generation of Palestinians looks like. These are going to be traumatized people who live in a wasteland. That's going to take some time to restore. The Israelis may be right that if the gates were open, up to 1 million Palestinians would almost leave immediately if they had a place to go. That doesn't mean that you don't have a traumatized generation that could radicalize and may very well radicalize. So uh, I I think those demonstrations were anti-Hamas, but they were anti-Israel, anti the Arabs, anti-everybody. You know, um, uh, but that doesn't mean that Hamas is not going to pay a price for this, and it knows it. It knows it.
Can you speak more to that?
Well, that's why they want a ceasefire. They understand that look, the Israeli argument to this is you can have the ceasefire today. All you need to do is disarm, and we'll give you your leader's passageway to leave. Just disappear. Obviously, that's not an option Hamas is going to accept. But at the same time, they cannot be seen to be prolonging the war.
In regards to, I've also been interested in this question lately. I don't know if you have thoughts on it, but do you feel that there are gaps in the way that diaspora populations, both on the Palestinian and the Jewish side in America, view everything that is happening compared to Israelis and Palestinians in, say, Gaza, or even Palestinians in the West Bank? Do you think there's a gap in the views between the diaspora populations and the populations in those portions of the world?
Yes, but maybe not quite in the way that you I think are implying. On the Palestinian side, it's been for months, maybe even the better part of a year, in which Hamas's popularity was far greater on the West Bank than it was in Gaza. Um, what the recent stepped up violence on the West Bank, both by vigilante settlers as well as by Israeli attacks and assaults on Palestinian refugee camps. What that has done, I don't know. But as a matter of principle, I've seen nothing to contradict that Hamas has greater popularity on the West Bank than it does in Gaza. On the Jewish side, I think you're seeing increasingly a Jewish community that's divided. A lot of Jews play a prominent role in the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests. Jewish youth, even before this war, were less attached. American Jewish youth, for sure, less attached to Israel than their parents were. And so, yes, there are divides. Uh, there are a significant number of Jewish communities that feel sorry, very uneasy about Israel's alignment with the far right, and they feel that because the far right are groups that they don't feel comfortable with in their own countries, whether that's France, whether that's Germany, whether that's Spain. So yes, there are divisions, but the divisions are not necessarily that clear cut.
Before we start closing out, what do you think we can take out of all of this right now? I mean, where do things stand in your view?
Uh, I think that we're, again, right, but I think this is broader than Gaza, even though Gaza may be the spear point of this. It's a world in which human rights no longer count. It's a world in which it's a jungle. The rule of law, whatever that was worth to start with, but nonetheless has been totally thrown out the window.
Did you, not to
And
interrupt you, but did you happen to see the Belgian prime minister saying he wouldn't abide by like the ICC arrest warrant for Netanyahu and citing, there's a difference between, our ethical considerations and the fact that we have to deal with realpolitik. I thought that was kind of interesting to hear a prime minister say that.
well,
I mean,
sure. I
it
mean,
feeds into what you're
look,
saying about the sort of human rights are sort of going
look
out
at
the window.
look at Viktor Orban, who resigned, who Hungary resigned, leaving the International Criminal Court hours before Netanyahu lands. But fact of the matter is that Netanyahu wanted to go to Poland in January for the anniversary of Auschwitz and didn't go because he was not guaranteed that he would not be arrested. Um, I think he would think twice about going to Britain or France. Think back of what happened in South Africa several years ago when the then Sudanese leader, who was indicted by the International Criminal Court on war crime charges, was at a conference, I believe it was, in South Africa. A South African court ordered his arrest, and he had to be smuggled out of the country through the back door. So, uh, Netanyahu's ability to travel is restricted de facto. Uh, I think a number of European states would have, as a matter of principle, a problem with Netanyahu traveling to their country because it would put them in a bind. In the case of Belgium, Belgium has an extraterritorial law. So, with other words, it can prosecute these kind of crimes, even if they were not committed on Belgian soil or were not in any form or fashion related to Belgium. So, even if the prime minister says, yeah, we have to make realpolitik concessions to what our values and morals are, a Belgian court could step in.
In regards to what you mentioned earlier, you've talked about it quite a bit. I think you wrote a whole piece a few years ago called "Shaping a 21st Century World Order: The Nation State versus Civilizational State." I
Yes, I
was
did.
wondering if you could expand on that whole nation state versus civilizational state uh, thesis, and because I hear a lot of people talk about we're moving towards a more multipolar world, and that's very dangerous in a lot of ways, but it seems like you're talking more along the lines of a nation state versus civilizational state as opposed to this discussion we see of multipolarity. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure. First of all, I think multipolarity and what I'm talking about in terms of civilizationalism versus the nation state are two different things.
Right. That's why I wanted
We
you to
are in,
expand. Go
yeah,
on.
yeah, we are in a multipolar world. We're in a world in which essentially big powers carve up spheres of influence, and we're already seeing that. What I was talking about in that article and several other articles that I've written about it is that you have a critical mass of world leaders, the usual suspects: Trump, Orban, Putin, Xi Jinping, Netanyahu, Erdogan, Viktor Orban, sorry, Narendra Modi, who think in terms, in civilizational terms. Their vision, and that's in part the justification for the war in Ukraine. They think in civilizational terms. They think in borders that are defined civilizationally. So Putin talks about the Russian world, which is essentially a world which incorporates whatever territory that that has Russian speakers or adherents to Russian culture as part of Russia. There's a but this may take us a little bit further than out of this. There's a book that was recently published by Hamid Dabashi, a Middle East scholar of Iranian origin. I think he's at Georgetown. I'm not 100% sure of that. In which he essentially argues that we live in a state of in a world of post-colonial states, and what he means by that is twofold: that essentially the state and the people are divorced from one another. The state essentially is there to protect its interests at the expense of the people, and that the way society is going to be organized in the future is going to be through civil society associations, women's organizations, environmental organizations, what have you. Which takes what I'm saying a step further, but in essence is in line with what I'm saying.
Why do you think it's important for people to understand this dynamic that you're talking about and this idea of the nation state versus civilizational state? Because I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around it because I think of us, I think of the world as being driven by nation states that are constantly seeking to uh, maintain their security in an anarchic world system. I know I sound like an egghead saying that, but it's, I
Look,
think
look,
nation states are inherently violent on their own. What does it mean for a civilizational state to be
well,
violent? What's the difference?
I mean, look, the notion of a nation state involves, as a matter of principle, the state monopolizing violence. Now, sure, you have the Second Amendment in the United States, and everybody's got a gun. But as a matter of principle, the prerogative of violence is the state's prerogative. Um, but what I think you're seeing is that for the state to maintain itself, I mean, this is what Dabashi essentially is arguing, and you can debate it, but nonetheless, there's certainly a kernel of truth in it, which is that the state is, because of the divorce between the state and the people, the state is becoming increasingly repressive. You're seeing that with Trump in the United States. I just saw an edict that came out by the Indonesian president, Indonesia being the world's largest um, Muslim democracy, in which uh, any journalist or researcher who enters Indonesia is being surveyed from the moment he steps foot at the airport to the moment he goes back to the airport to leave. So, you get into the elements of the surveillance society and so on and so forth. But, hotels have to report the journalist movement, for example. I mean, there were a whole list of uh, uh, of issues that I noted. I don't remember them all, but I mean, I did note them because I travel frequently to Indonesia.
Are there any historical precedents to this or time periods that you would find this comparable to?
Uh, Look, I mean, you've had autocratic leaders throughout history. I mean, you go back to the early days of Islam. Islam's golden age of the 6th to 10th century was because you had an independent clergy who were major players. And when the what were then Muslim states or Muslim entities, when those entities were militarized, as you see with the police in the United States, for example, um, those states became more repressive.
I know we have to get going and close out here, but I saw that you had a video up on the Palestinian Israeli battle of narratives. Maybe you could summarize what you were dealing with there and the sort of ways in which there really can't be a compromise with the way these narratives are playing out now.
Well, first of all, the question is whether you need to compromise. With other words, whether or not conflicting, opposing narratives cannot exist next to each other. What I was trying to argue in that piece was that um, normal international law, normal diplomatic practice is that you recognize a state. You don't legitimize necessarily its national narrative. You don't endorse its policies. You recognize a state and say, we want to have relations. Israel demands that its right to exist be recognized. And the reason for that is that because of the way the state was established, um, there are many who question that, even if they're willing to accept a two-state solution, because that's the only practical way of getting out of this mess. But nonetheless, they want the Palestinians to basically say, yeah, you took our land and you had every right to do so. That's not going to ever be the Palestinian narrative. And whether it's irrelevant whether you agree with that narrative or not. That is their narrative. That's their perception of their history, just as much as Israel's perception of its history is that it had a right to the land. Um, those are narratives that simply are going to exist and have to coexist.
What I was going to say in that regard, and it's a frustration with me when talking with people about this issue, is I consider both Israeli identity and Palestinian identity to be, I mean, they're socially constructed identities. That doesn't mean they're illegitimate. I think they're both legitimate, but I
Look,
sometimes
look,
feel as
whatever
if,
you're.
Mhm.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I sometimes feel as if there's this push to say, no, Palestinians can't have that identity. And I don't think that's helpful in any way to try to deny them an identity that
Look,
has organically emerged.
first
Yeah.
of all, first of all, your identity is your identity. Whether I like your identity or not is neither here nor there. You're entitled to your own identity as much as I am. And I don't really care what other people think about my identity. It's my identity. Now, it gets problematic when you then try to curtail the rights of others. Ultimately, principle of democracy is live and let live. It's the acceptance of a diversity of whatever, including a diversity of identity, a diversity of national narratives. And de facto, let's be clear about it. It doesn't really matter whether Israel has a right to exist. Israel exists, and Palestinians are willing to accept a two-state solution because that's the de facto reality. Whether they think it's right or wrong, they too have to deal with the reality.
In other words, in some ways, we get too bogged down into the question of identity and national narratives rather than just the cold hard reality of what we're dealing with.
Well, no, I mean, your identity. There's I may have told you this before. There's a famous moment in the late 1970s where Ezer Weizmann, who was later became president of um, of Israel, was the commander of the Air Force and defense minister when Anwar Sadat came to Jerusalem. And at some point later, he was in Gaza, coincidentally, in an office, standing in front of a map the Likud's map of the Middle East, which was Israel across the Jordan River, including Jordan itself. And he was asked about it and was asked about what the difference was between that map and the Palestinian map of a secular democratic state, so a one state across Israel and the West Bank. And his answer was, Arafat can dream, I can dream.
You have told me that story before.
Yeah, but I just think it's a very telling story.
Can you elaborate real quick on that?
Well, what it means is exactly what we are talking about. You can have different national narratives, and you're entitled to that. It's a dream.
The problem is when you try to make the identities or national narratives like illegal, or you attack them, right?
Well, no, the problem is, okay, the way Israel translate that is in security terms. It's not about simply securing my borders. It's about imposing my narrative because that's part of my security.
Do you think there's a way around that, or a way forward that gets beyond that? Or
Look,
do you
at
think
this
it's
point, I
inevitable that
think
eventually it'll have to go beyond that? Maybe that's the question.
not necessarily, not necessarily. Look, at the end of the day, if aspirations, including national social economic aspirations, are in a compromise in which everybody has to put water in the wine, but nonetheless in a form of fashion that everybody has a stake in the status quo that's being established. It doesn't have to necessarily um, uh, escalate, but in an environment in which the other, and this goes for both Hamas and Israel, the other is not human, and the price in human life of realizing what it is you want to realize doesn't matter. Certainly, in terms of the human life of the other, you get what you have today.
I think that's a dark note to end on, but we'll end on that note. How can my listeners keep up with your work, James? And what's the one big takeaway you want my listeners to have from this?
Look, I think that the first and foremost, this war has to end. These what I think what Israel is doing, in my mind, is unconscionable, and totally out of proportion to anything that happened on October 7th. And again, not to minimize October 7th in any form or fashion. Um, I think what we've seen is a tremendous setback. You have an Israeli population that wants an end to the war. There's no question about it. But 65% of Israel today identifies itself on the right wing of politics. It's not prone or empathetic to a compromise. And I think that you're going to have a destitute Palestinian population that is going to be destitute for a long time.
And how can my listeners keep up with your work?
Subscribe to my Substack column at jamesmdorsey.substack.com. Paid subscribers are particularly welcome. That allows me to continue. And I think it's also important in terms of trying to sustain a free press and freedom of expression. So I would be delighted if your listeners would subscribe free or preferably paid, but anyone is welcome.
Thank you so much, James. You're always gracious with your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.